I'm Besa Luce, and welcome to Other Talking Points, a K2.0 podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about the experiences of women journalists in Kosovo, Serbia, and the broader region. Freedom of the press isn't only about freedom from government or corporate restraints on reporting the truth. Only if there is gender equality in the workplace and out in the field can there be real freedom of the press. Though women's perspectives and voices are increasingly incorporated into media content, there's been relatively limited discussion about how media outlets are failing women journalists in the workplace. Women have long tracked the pervasiveness of gender discrimination in the newsroom through unofficial accounts, anecdotes, and whisper networks. But two recent reports have documented the full extent of workplace sexism in the media sphere in Kosovo and Serbia. The finding of these reports align with global surveys that reflect the unfortunate truth that gender-based discrimination is prevalent in the media workplace. Relying on surveys and conversations with over 500 women journalists across the two countries, it is one of the first comprehensive looks into the topic. Some of the forms of discrimination highlighted in the research are sexual harassment, ageism, and the lack of support for journalists who are mothers. These obstacles result in hostile work environments that can compromise the well-being of women journalists and hinder their professional growth. The report is developed partly out of the desire of the survey participants, who expressed the need for an investigation into the position of women in the media, hoping that the findings would facilitate changes for safer workplaces and for newsrooms that are inclusive of older workers with valuable experience and expertise. Today, I have with me Masha Mileusnic and Dafina Halile. Masha Mileusnic is a journalist and a member of the Serbia-based network Women Journalists Against Violence Towards Women. Dafina Halile is a journalist and contributing editor at K2.0. She conducted the Kosovo portion of the recent report on the position of women in journalism. Masha, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me in this conversation, and I'm very honored to talk to you all.
Great, thank you. And Dafina, I'm looking forward to getting into things with you as well.
Thank you, Besa. It's very nice to be your guest, actually, and it's an honor to be here with Masha as well.
Great. Let's get started. I think there's a lot for us to talk about today. And Dafina, maybe I'd like to start with you, since you were the leader of the report on the position of women journalists in Kosovo's media. So maybe if you can just talk a bit about your overall experience with the project and what were some of the most striking findings that you and your team discovered during the course of the research, and potentially a bit of a comparison between the report in Kosovo and in Serbia. What were the differences maybe, but also similarities?
It was, I remember, in 2021 when Peaceful Change Initiative organization, they asked me to moderate an hours-long meeting with the journalists of Serbia and Kosovo to talk about the gender representation, but also about the position of women within the newsroom. And somehow, the main point, after like 4 or 5 hours of conversation, the main point that was raised was that sexism is not just like an evident thing in the media production and how we report about gender and women, but also it's part of the workplace. And I think this was very important to be discussed, particularly with Kosovo journalists, because as Masha will probably can share later, Serbia already had some research and a lot of reports, and this discussion was kind of since a long time opened. And the other interesting thing is that in the time when the conversation with Peaceful Change Initiative happened was we were still during pandemic, and we were already witnessing how the pandemic was further magnifying inequalities, and many hidden experiences of the crisis were gendered. And also in the newsroom here at Kosovo 2.0, but also on social media, we saw how many women who were actually at the forefront of pandemic were like cashiers, were like the main workers during the pandemic, were female reporters in the ground, were the female nurses, the female cashiers. And what was evident for the first time was that when we talk about newsroom, it is actually women that are leading the field. And somehow that was in contradiction with what we see during TV shows, and also in contradiction with the anecdotes and also with the stories that we hear about position of women within the newsroom. And so it was all this need to do this survey and for the first time to talk about what does it mean to be a journalist in Kosovo. And since Peaceful Change Initiative covered also Serbia, the survey was done in both countries. The findings are similar in Kosovo and in Serbia. That was not such an unpredictable thing. Main findings were that around 50% of women earn less than the national average, and around 40% of them work more than 40 hours per week. But I think this is not just like a gender thing. It goes also within the exploitation of workers within the workplace in Serbia and in Kosovo. It happens also to male reporters and workers. But I need to highlight some findings that I think they are like the most important ones, and that highlight the gender discrimination within the newsroom, such as sexual harassment, such as ageism. And for example, 40% of women that were surveyed, and that is a huge number, they said that they cover politics. And it is the same in Serbia and in Kosovo, which is completely, as I said also earlier, it is in contrary to the assertion that journalism is a male-dominated field, and what we see every night in the evening shows. 20% in Kosovo and 25% in Serbia, and almost 30% in both countries feel that they are discriminated based on their appearance and on their age. 1 in 4, or around 25% of women in both countries said that they were sexually harassed in the workplace. And I think this is particularly the main finding when it comes to the report in Kosovo. Sexual harassment, sexual assault in the workplace within the newsroom, it is something that was never publicly discussed, unfortunately, until now in Kosovo. And another interesting finding is that around 50% of journalists said that their private life suffered because of their work, and 30% feel that their private life affects their job and actually affects their progress in work. And for me, this 30% of women saying that their private life affects their job was quite interesting, because when we kind of like looked into aggregated data to check out who are profiles of the women, we saw that the majority of women, all around 97 of women that said that the private life affects their job, are women who are married and who have children. Meaning that journalists have to go home and claim the respective traditional roles as mothers and absolute caregivers. That is something that probably we'll discuss also later during the conversation.
Yes, definitely. That's a lot of insightful, to say the least, data. And maybe I will continue by focusing in one of them for now, and to talk a bit more about sexual harassment. And Masha, you're a longtime journalist, and you are likely familiar with the survey's findings, but also in general, this is an area that you have been very active in through the association. And let's focus a bit on sexual harassment that women journalists have been subject to in the workplace. And I think in the region, we've seen also that there's been a lot with the Me Too movement of women coming out and speaking about sexual harassment in the workplace. And one of the triggers also to this was by journalists themselves, who were uncovering the stories, and also through their investigative journalism. But at the same time, have journalists broken their own silence about the experiences of abuse? Has this conversation happened to what extent in Serbia, but also other countries more broadly in the region?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Because not just because of the Me Too movement, but because we saw that kind of threat really threatening, as I can say. Because we are so far, most of us have only been spared from physical violence, as a women journalist. Not all, most. We are subject to everything else. Because the sexual harassment and abuse of women journalists are also a reflection of wider social problem, as you said, the sexism. And in most cases, attacks are not directed at the topic, covered, but rather at us as women, our families and private lives. And that's the problem we try to encounter in our group, Women Journalists Against Violence, because when we started with the group, we were just targeted, reporting about violence against women, about ethic reporting about violence against women. And when we get together and held some meetings, we just started to share our own stories about sexual harassment in our job, in our newsrooms, especially because when we talked about sexual harassment in journalism, we never talked about, in office sexual harassment, because we suffer from sexual harassment on our job, in field, when we cover stories from, I don't know, demonstrations on the street, from everywhere else, from in the field, and when we record and do interviews with the males, in every part of journalism, we are focused on that kind of external sexual harassment. But when we got together in our group, Women Journalists Against Violence, it's very important to say, because why we are doing this group just Women Journalists Against Violence against women, because it's a safe place. If we had some male colleagues, respectfully, we have really great male colleagues. It doesn't matter, we are not talking about that. But we feel safe when women are just around. And that's why we broke that kind of silence in our meetings in a group, Women Journalists Against Violence. Nobody talked about in office, in newsrooms, about sexual harassment. And it's really something we should talk more about it, and not just talk. We have to have education. We have to raise awareness, because look at these percentages. 29.1% of respondents were victims of sexual harassment. I really don't believe that it's so low percentage, because every one of us, were victims of sexual harassment in some way, verbally, etc., etc. Not just physically. Sexual harassment is not just physical thing. It's in all other levels, in all so many levels. And that low percentage of respondents who said that were victims of sexual harassment is just, they don't know that they were sexual harassed. They don't recognize it as a sexual harassment, like light sexism in kind of in small talks in newsrooms or on field, etc., etc. It is sexual harassment, but we don't recognize it as it is, and that's why I think we have to focus on education, on raising awareness, etc., etc., as we talk about it in our meeting during the networking project of British Council in Pristina. Bessa, you remember that?
Yes, maybe just for people listening, we had a meeting actually in Pristina a few months ago, and Masha was also here at our offices, where we gathered women journalists from Kosovo just to talk about their experiences in the field, in the newsroom, and to discuss the possibilities of maybe creating a similar network for women journalists in Kosovo. And Dafina, here I would like to connect with you, because Masha mentioned, yes, 29% is too low of a number. I think this is from the 500 women that participated in the survey, but I think it's also important what she said, that maybe some don't even recognize that some of their experiences are actually experiences that can be defined as sexual harassment. And while there hasn't been a Me Too movement, anything similar like that in Kosovo, like it hasn't happened in the past few years, but at the same time, this report, the survey that you worked on and that you did, clearly shows that, yes, women are subject to sexual harassment in the workplace. Why do you think they're not speaking out? Why we haven't heard women in Kosovo or women journalists specifically maybe come out with their stories?
Maybe I'll start with why women journalists are not speaking out or didn't speak up until now, and I want to relate to something what Masha said, which is I think is quite important, and why it's also important for us to continue with the conversation that Kosovo 2.0 hosted 2 months ago about gathering women journalists and to see how can we kind of like continue from there and what can we do. Shall we do an association which is very similar to where Masha is part of, or shall we combine associations? Because while associations that is with only female participants, it somehow paves the way to a safe place for journalists to speak up. In Kosovo, journalists didn't have something like that until now. And that was quite interesting because, for example, Masha said that 29% is a very low number. And it is a lower number. But when the report came out in Kosovo, for journalists, for the newsroom, even 29% was such a big number when they were like told that, hey, one in 4 journalists were subjected to sexual harassment, which was kind of like very surprising finding, which is not supposed to be a surprising finding, but it means that actually this conversation never happened the way how it should have happened in Kosovo. And for the first time, it is a survey that provided a safe space for this conversation to happen, which is good. But on the other hand, it kind of like demonstrates and it talks how also I would also say association of journalists and newsrooms and editor-in-chiefs were failing actually women journalists for all these years, because it cannot be for the first time one survey to provide a safe space for the harassment to be documented. And I remember it was like around 100 women journalists in Kosovo that provided very thorough accounts of harassment that happened inside the newsroom, where perpetrators are male colleagues, editor-in-chiefs, managers, editors, cameramen, editors in the field, then people who hold public position that are part of the government, are very famous in the business that they lead, who are usually sources of women journalists and are very important sources for the story developments. So as women journalists in Kosovo, that is something that I was aware of, for example, for many, many years. And it is something that female journalists would kind of like talk to each other, but not majority of female journalists, because I was also in many different environments and spaces that were also women journalists saying that sexual harassment is not part of the media where they work. And again, to link to Masha, I think also that the whole idea, how do we perceive sexual harassment, and that many times it occurs in front of our eyes, but we actually don't see it and don't condemn it as sexual harassment. And going back to the Me Too movement and how it didn't happen in Kosovo, I don't think that I can have like a really good answer for this, but every time when somebody speaks in public, like for example the case with Medina, who's like a young girl in Kosovo who spoke publicly being harassed by her professor, which is a typical best illustration of how sexual harassment is abuse of power and privilege, and somehow the conversation just ends. You don't have other women following up. And all of that is part of the pattern that we have actually witnessed since 1999 in the whole post-war history of Kosovo, where every time when a woman spoke up in public, she would be met with threats, intimidation, fearing retribution, and with lack of trust. She wouldn't be believed. And the great example of that are, for example, survivors of wartime rape. I remember it was just like in the last past 5 years when you had, for example, Vasvije Kasnici talking about publicly being raped by a Serbian parliamentary during 1999 or 98, and you had all the citizens kind of like taking it as how did it happen? Why we didn't hear this story before? And actually, those stories were told since 1999. The problem is that all those voices would be kind of like shut down, silenced, and end up in a courtroom, would become part of a justice system where victims would be victimized again, very similar to what happens in the characters of Kafka's Process.
I think there's something very important in what you were talking about, Daphne, that the stories of abuse, stories of harassment or gender-based discrimination, they've been there, and they were being told, and most of the time they were being shared within these kind of safe places. Because even since 1999 to today, for example, you mentioned women that were also sexually abused or raped during the war. They were talking to one another, but they were talking within safe spaces of NGOs or places where they felt that they could talk to one another. And it links, Masha, to what you were saying on how the Women's Association in Serbia actually started. It started out of women having this need to just talk to one another and share their experiences, in your specific case, within the workplace, within the media that they were working in. So maybe I would like to just go a bit beyond just sexual harassment to talk a bit also about what are the stories, Masha, that women journalists there share about the types of discriminations that they face based on age, for example, but also women that are women journalists that are also mothers. We talked earlier about how you finish the job, but then most women journalists, they go home and then they have to assume this traditional role, but maybe also at the workplace they're not really understood that when they are mothers that potentially they might have also different needs. So what are some of the experiences that you can share from your work and the association in Serbia?
Yes, we shared all those experiences. We have same experiences all over the world, not just in Serbia or Kosovo or Balkans. That's kind of labor right violations, and that's social inequality, and that's patriarchy in the core. We are talking about everything that sums up in the patriarchy roots, and that's the sexism, misogyny, sexual harassment, physical vulnerability of the women in the society. And that's why we have that kind of social inequality, because women are mothers, they're caretakers, they're everything in a home, in the house. They do all the job and then come to work, and they don't have they don't have shorter work hours or something like that. They have maternity leave, but beside that, they don't have any kind of support at work. And that's why 20% of women journalists feel that their private life affects their job, and that's the patriarchy. Private life is affecting my job. I have to be as productive as my male colleagues. That's the point I'm seeing here in this finding of 24%. They're thinking backwards. Because their job has to be on the first place. They have to be productive. They have to be successful as their male colleagues, which are not, caregivers, and they're not doing our domestic job that women are doing. They don't have to, care about children and lunches and everything, and cleaning the house and going to shopping. They don't have to do that, and that's why they can be productive. They can spend more hours at work and be more successful than women colleagues. And women have to put it up to the males. We have in patriarchy that kind of role model. We have to be as successful as men. We are just always comparing to men, and that's the problem.
And Masha, just to ask, I'm just curious to also know, through the association, do you also besides providing that safe space and for those conversations to happen, are you also advocating for changes of, let's say, policies, internal policies within media outlets? So in terms of how they can change practices and behaviors? And if you can share some specific example in that regard, it would be great.
Well, we don't have specific example. I don't know which specific example would it be. We are talking about it. We are advocating that. We are talking publicly about our problems, and that's the main thing. We have trainings, educations, and everything that you can just build awareness about our problems, and that's the starting point. Because that's the main starting point. If you are not aware of the things that they are happening to you, you cannot fight it. And if you are not publicly talk about your problems as a woman journalist, you don't have credibility to do it for other women to report about violence against other women. We have, that kind of education and trainings, and I think that's the, example. And we have, the part of the group are working about policies, about pop-up trainings with newsrooms. We are going to, and we are doing that, especially with tabloids. We're just popping up. We're just trying to talk to them and to change their, perspective on, first of all, on ethical reporting about violence against women, which is our main cause in our group, Women Journalists Against Violence. And after that, we are advocating for them to make internal policies, because we all have, like journalism codex in every country. But besides that, we don't have, internal policies, because I think internal in newsroom policies, media outlet policies, internal are really important, because in that kind of policies you can be responsible as a person, as an employee, about your jobs, about your doing, about your about everything you're doing in the newsroom, not just work related. And we, other than our guidelines or ethical reporting, we have those trainings about, awareness about our position as a women journalist in newsrooms. And that's it for now.
And I think to stick with this with regard to internal policies, I think one thing that, and we've discussed about this, Dafin, before, but I think you probably have some experiences with the work on the report. I think in a lot of media in Kosovo, for example, there's not clear internal guidelines or policies if someone wanted to report a case of sexual harassment, be it from within the newsroom, but also maybe as an experience from the field. So can you maybe just talk a bit about that? What did the women journalists that you interviewed and talked to, what did they say about the opportunities that whether they have actually a clear line of how they can report a case of sexual harassment, for example?
This is something I think I understood later after the report, because the survey didn't have the question that asked the journalist what did the media organization do after they reported the harassment. But many of them still they kind of like gave their own account about that and talked. There was like at least 10 or 15 that said that when they reported sexual harassment to the editor or supervisor, they were completely discouraged from them. They were just like said, okay, whatever, you have to continue with the story. And how traumatic the experience is for reporters and for journalists in general, it's, I think, particularly evident in some answers where they said that they just left the job. Because it was not just like experience so traumatic for them, but it was also this discouragement that they had from their own supervisors, that they didn't have any other solution than just like leave the job, because their dignity, their integrity was touched upon, and still they didn't find any kind of like support from anybody within the newsroom. But from informal conversations, which I think kind of like tell a significant part of the truth, is that when I say informal conversation, is with different journalists from different types of media all across Kosovo. There's like no clear guidelines, there's like no clear policies how to tackle sexual harassment, or that describe what is sexual harassment, how does the media need to support the journalist after they report this abuse. So again, it just like confirms that that media organization are not tackling seriously sexual harassment at all.
Yes, Masha, if you want to connect.
Yes, I'm really thankful for that insight, because that's why we are gearing up our strength in our groups, and that's why I'm talking about networking, and that's not just me, but all of my colleagues from the Women Journalists Against Violence group, because when we put our voices together, we're amplifying our voices, and that's why we have to stick together to talk about our issues, and that's why we have, the website. We will aim to provide information on protecting one's safety to all women journalists, whether they are members of the group or not, and to keep adding new sources, handbook, research reports, to provide information and the tools for reporting of violence against women journalists, to just empower each other to do that, to talk with each other, or publicly if they are able to do that. And that's why I'm talking about networking so often. I think that's one of the ways to tackle this problem, because we don't have that kind of support in our newsrooms, because men are on the top positions, on the managerial positions. Women are, like workers in the newsroom. Very few of them in Serbia are on the top managerial positions, and in journalists organizations, we have like some kind of movement in all other journalists associations to tackle violence against women journalists. But that's the consequence of our work from our group, because we put it in the spotlight, we put it in the headlines, we are talking about it, we were making reports for our media outlets, we were talking publicly about that, and that's why we just changed that kind of thing, that women journalists are not talking about themselves ever, because, well, I'm returning to patriarchy thing, because we were we have to put it in the headlines, but not our stories, and that's why we are changing all of that through networking, through empowering, through solidarity, through connecting with each other.
No, just to add to Masha, like the importance of the network, and it also kind of like tells the emergency of it, that something needs to be done similar in Kosovo, because I remember after the survey was published, it was at least 3 journalists who actually left the job because they were harassed at the workplace, told me that they sent the report to their former supervisors. For them, sending the report to the former supervisors was kind of like empowering thing, kind of like letting them know, here is like the report that actually documents that you enabled sexual harassment to happen where I was an employee. And still we are talking about a survey, about a document, which is completely different thing from the networking and from the Association of Women Journalists and from a safe spaces where women are physically present and where they can share their stories, and which is much more tangible in the end than, just like a survey or a link in the report somewhere online.
But it's a start, and I always kind of say this, that sometimes you cannot come up with a solution if you don't call out or identify the problem. So I do think it's a very good step, and hopefully it will bring about changes. But in Daphne, I would like to also connect with you a bit about ageism, so about the discrimination that happens based on age and appearance, because in the report it's basically either like younger journalists or older journalists who have experienced ageism in the work. So can you talk a bit about that and how you perceive this age-based discrimination, especially against older women within the larger labor market in Kosovo?
No, the good thing about the surveys is, and you can sometimes kind of check this aggregated data, which actually tells much more than the answer yes or no. And when we checked who are the profiles that answered with yes, that they feel that are discriminated based on appearance and age, were ages that are younger than 24, so women that are younger than 24, and women that are older than 55, if I'm not wrong. And when we went to see the whole, what they actually witnessed and what they wrote about the experiences, we saw that younger journalists are very much objectified, which is also related with sexism, which kind of channels its way through sexual harassment, but also through objectification, that there are sometimes young journalists told that they need to kind of wear much more makeup in order to look serious when they interview politicians. Then on other times they are told they need to look more sexy when they need to interview artists, depending who they are supposed to interview. And then you have all these younger journalists that are all the time patronized and by older reporters, being told that they are not fit up to, for example, to cover particular fields such as politics. And then what I think needs much more to be addressed, and actually to see how is the media failing, is ageism when it comes to discriminating women-based older women. I think nobody until now did, at least in Kosovo, a thorough research and analysis about it. Where is the age when older women are leaving their jobs as a journalist? One explanation can be the nature of work and the nature of what kind of public policies are there for women who are mothers, and the lack of progressive legislation that actually gives, for example, maternity leave, but doesn't give paternity leave to fathers. And somehow it kind of supports the idea that women are absolute caretakers within the family. And somehow also media is condemning women through the lens of these cultural norms, because instead of supporting women that are mothers, they actually are not finding the solutions to how is to be a mother and a journalist. What can media actually do better in regard of this?
And I think this very nicely kind of helps us tie into the last question, because we've been talking about sexual harassment prevalent in the newsroom, in the field, women journalists being discriminated on age, and all of this also points to just ultimately it's violations of workers' rights, but also it's very much gendered. It's patriarchy, as Masha was talking about it earlier. So for the end, can you just maybe talk a bit how all of this also affects the work of the media itself, because it does also end up affecting what content ultimately is covered or not, or the angles that are taken to specific issues. So maybe how all of this, what women journalists go through, affects the work of the media outlet itself, and why maybe the media are also a very good place where change can potentially happen. Because if women journalists start being the ones actually being vocal and talking about it, it could maybe potentially help or be a sign of support to other women to speak of their own experiences. So Masha, can you maybe talk about these two different aspects, how it affects media work, but also the importance that this activism also comes maybe from women journalists?
Yes. It's very important question that you raised right now, because it really affects our reporting work of the media, because women are majority of newsrooms. Yes, we know that all around the world, not just here in Balkans. And I consider media an important ally in every kind of struggle and teaching in society, and that's why we are journalists. We are trying to make things better. We are trying to change things for better, to improve our society. And that's why it really affects the work of media and the way we are addressing the issues in our society. I think media have a great, maybe greatest responsibility of all when it comes to reporting about issues in societies, especially about violence, because violence, not just against women, violence in general, is the biggest social problem. And the media can help by presenting violence against women in reports as a social problem, and by following in the process of reporting professional, ethical, legal standards, yet above all by honoring our human obligation to respect the victims. And the media often worsen the situation by, as we spoke earlier, by secondarily victimizing the victim through, tabloid style reporting. And not just tabloid style reporting, all, mainstream media just make all those kind of mistakes. And such reporting really causes catastrophic consequences for the victim and for the public in general, for the maybe future victims, or just making people feel unsafe when they are experiencing some kind of violence or talking about issues in the society, not just related to the violence itself. And that's why I think we have to be so much responsible towards us. And when we are talking about us as a journalist, our issues, that's the same issues everybody experiencing in every society. And that's why we have to talk to each other about that kind of ethical reporting, about talking about every issues in public, and to just raise awareness and to talk about it in our medias.
I think because we're running slowly out of time, so maybe we will just connect here. And Daphne, maybe you can talk more about the second question.
For example, we just mentioned how the media reports about femicide. It doesn't report a social problem, and that it to some extent also tells about how the media sees itself. Because when we report about femicide, when the mainstream media reports about femicide, it reports as a basic information, just like another murder had happened in the country, and it doesn't dig into the whole cultural and institutionalized patriarchy that actually enables and facilitates the murder of women. And that also tells you something. That tells you actually what you said, Besa, that how can media contribute to the change if they are not aware of all the inequalities within your newsroom. It tells actually the media is seeing themselves as a factor of change. Because when we talk about reporting, when we talk about journalism, we still talk about outdated principles of being really objective and not being, for example, political at all. And if you want to talk about harassment, to ageism, to different inequalities, to workers' rights, you first need to start talking that media and journalists are political. Not political in the sense of supporting political parties, but political in kind of really I'm not even kind of like saying about advocacy journalists, because that is completely something different, but like having a clear position and political stance on how to discuss femicide, how to discuss gender, how to discuss LGBTQ persons in society, how to discuss heteronormativity. So it means that it needs that actually the media needs to kind of address itself and also focus itself more in feminist theorizing. I don't know how to do that, but it needs to start from the thing that gender needs to be taken seriously. So that, I think, needs to be kind of like maybe one of the first points.
And I do think that actually that's a very good note to end with. And I think that that is happening more and more. And I think that the report, the findings, and everything we discussed today, in this episode at least, contributes towards that. But of course, this is an ongoing conversation. And I know that, Masha, you will for sure with the association continue to have it, and also us here at K2.0. Thank you so much to both of you for being guests on the show. It was great talking to you.
Thank you, Bessa.
Thank you very much.
Other Talking Points is a K2.0 podcast. You can listen to it regularly on our website, Kosovo2.0.com, or by subscribing to Kosovo 2.0 on Spotify.